Okay, ladies and gents, going to start. First of all, thanks very much for coming. I know there's lots of really exciting sessions on, so thanks very much for coming to listen to us talk about when stuff doesn't go according to plan. And it sets expectations nicely. If there's any mishaps in the presentation, we can pretend that's just part of the theme. Okay, so this is Trials and Tribulations. We're talking about how RCTs are often easier conceptually than they are in practice. I'm Raj, I'm the Senior Advisor of the Behavioural Insights team. I've been working with the team for about 3 years, mainly on education and skills stuff, but a bit more of a range than that. And Michael, just introduce yourself.
Not really. I'm Michael Sanders, I'm Head of Research and Evaluation of the Behavioural Insights team. I've been with the team for about 3.5 years, and I am the biggest failure in the room, so that's why Raj is inviting me.
Okay, good stuff. So this is a bit of a group therapy session. If you need to let out any stuff that hasn't worked out for you, please feel free. There will be specific points where we invite questions, but there's a little bit of technical jargon in here, which we're going to try and minimise. But if at any point you're not quite sure of anything we've said, please do say, because it will just make the rest of the talk much more enjoyable, I'm sure, for everybody. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the fact that trials are important. Now, probably you're here, you're at Behavioural Exchange, you've been looking at trials, you've reasonably solved on that case. We're just going to reiterate why. And it might also be helpful, just here's some language that we often use when we're talking to people who entirely maybe are not convinced. We're going to talk about some important stuff you should do before a trial, during, and then after. And we're going to talk about the things you should do and then the things you kind of have to make up as you're going along. And then we're going to talk about, we're looking ahead, what's our vision for doing trials in the future? So at the moment, they can be quite labour-intensive at times. And we're working, you know, if you guys, or some of you guys are policymakers, what can we start doing to make sure that this is all less work in the future, once we're all convinced of the importance of it? And we've been very, very kind. Some people have been very kind. We asked a bunch of speakers who are here, we said, could you give us some stories when stuff hasn't quite worked out as you hoped it would? And I was absolutely flooded with emails with people just desperate to show off their scars. Some of you may recognise this scene from Jaws. If you don't worry. But the idea was that it was amazing how many people just came forward and said, oh yeah, one time I thought this was going to happen. It didn't work out at all. So as we're going along, I'm going to be dropping in some very funny and actually very useful anecdotes from some really great practitioners. Okay, first of all, I just want to get a sense of who's in the room. How many of you guys have run a trial before, or at least worked on a trial? Oh, good. Okay, so good. I'd say over half, well over half. And put your hands up again if everything went exactly how you thought it was going to go at the start. Well, no one's going to like that person. Yeah, actually, it went beautifully. All right, so, okay, so most of you will be familiar with some of these issues. Okay, so we're going to start off, I just want you to imagine a case study, right? It might help with just some of the explanations we go through for the next 5 minutes. Let's think of a policy which sounds entirely plausible. One could easily imagine a minister announcing this on Newsnight, partially on the hoof, and they're sort of saying, yeah, we're really interested in getting ex-offenders back into work more easily. The reason is their unemployment rate is much higher, and if they do find work, they're significantly less likely to re-offend. So it'd be useful if they had some kind of work experience at some point. It seems completely reasonable. I think we're all agreeing with that. Go, right, that sounds plausible. And let's say a bunch of really, really smart people all get together in a room, maybe do some field work, and they come up with a policy. And what they do is they take a group of ex-offenders, which are those stick people there, they implement the intervention, afterwards they may even do some evaluation, and they go, okay, some people found work, the ones in green, some people did not found work, the ones in black. I'm sure we would all expect the minister to announce this to be a triumphant success, that's fine. But of course, we have some questions which are unanswered here. We don't really know what would have happened if we hadn't done the policy. We don't know how many of those ex-offenders would have found work anyway. So instead, we like to randomise into 2 groups. And at this moment, seeing as we have the head of research here, he's going to talk you through how a trial works.
Thanks, Raj. So as Raj was saying, since most of you have run trials before, I won't belabor the point. The process is very, very simple. We just get however many people we have, and we divide them into, in this case, 2 groups randomly, so typically by a flip of the coin. And that means we can compare the 2 groups much more causally, so we can actually see what the impact of our policy intervention is. So what we end up with is a world that looks much more like this one, where people are divided into 2 groups. One group receives whatever they were going to receive before, so treatment as usual, and the other group receives our new intervention that our ministers announced on Newsnight. And what we see after that is that from the control group, one of the people in one of our little stick figures has got a job afterwards, and typically you'll find when people are in prison, they're almost all unemployed. And then when they leave prison, some of them are just going to get jobs as a matter of course. And then 4 people in our treatment group have got it, which means our intervention has increased employment by 3 people out of our sample. So we can say this has been effective. Obviously, those of you who've run trials before will be saying there's no way you're powered to detect an effect in a sample this size, but it's purely illustrative. So when I was introducing this story, this sort of case study of an ex-offenders program for getting back into work, did you assume that they were going to be having this work experience before or after they, just to think about this in your heads, before or after they were released? Do you think it was going to be paid or unpaid work experience? Do you think it was going to be compulsory, so did they have to go, or was it going to be voluntary? Or were they going to be working in institutions that were purely offenders? So, for example, you can imagine a local shop creating artisan bagels run exclusively by offenders, or are they going to be working in other places where there are sort of more general population? And so, because there are these many options, and I'm almost 100% confident, having discussed this with Raj, that when we're thinking about this policy, and we've been working together for a long time, we've both got very different ideas of what the policy should be. And so there's not necessarily, you get a bunch of smart people in the room, you're going to get every single combination of these. There's not necessarily one thing you want to be testing, one possible version of the intervention. And what that means is we can run a multi-arm trial where we compare our controls, not just one intervention, but 2 interventions. And this is really helpful from an academic standpoint when you're working with a trial partner and you're trying to get them on board with the idea of running a trial. It's say, you have an idea about how to make the world better, I have an idea about how to make the world better. Let's run both of them, let's test to see which one's best. And in my case, I always often, if it's a trial partner I have a good relationship with, so I'll bet you 20 quid, or $30 for those of you who are American, other currencies are available, that my intervention is going to come out on top of your intervention. And so far, I'm only about 300 pounds lighter. But it does it makes it fun for the partner, and it makes it much more enjoyable. And so the process then is you test in your first trial, what you can do is you test 2 interventions against each other. You see, in this example, the intervention 1 gets 2 people back into work, the control group gets 1, and the intervention 2 gets 4. So by some very crude maths, we end up with 50% in the intervention 2. So intervention 2 is the best one. That's great. Now you can roll that out and make that national policy. As you can see by the large white space on the right-hand side of this slide, this isn't the end. So you roll out to full population. And then what you can do is you can say, OK, this intervention worked really well. What's next? Do we now believe this is the perfect policy? Do we think we've solved the problem of unemployment among ex-offenders to as great an extent as it can possibly be solved? And given the fact we still have half of them not getting jobs, and this is an implausibly effective intervention, as any of you who've ever actually worked in policy will know, we've still got half of them not, so we can do another trial. We can test a new iteration. So we can find a second or third intervention where the intervention 2 becomes the control group, and we have a new intervention which we're going to call intervention 3. And that works a little bit better again. So we're slowly, incrementally working our way up. And then we can do this again, and again, and again, and then we have this amazing piece of slide deck, which I didn't create because I can't work PowerPoint. And over the course of time, what you see is you're in an infinite series of these trials, or in this case, sort of several of these trials, and you slowly work your way towards an outcome that's much more desirable than where you started. So in the first place, we had about 5% of people in our control group over here, and at the far end we can get up to a much, much higher percentage of that through consistent iteration and variation of our treatments and our trials. So there's a sort of tendency to think a trial is a solution. It's not a solution, it's part of a solution. 1,000 trials, 1,000,000 trials might be a solution, but yeah, so does anybody have any questions at this stage? Given the fact you've all run trials, I'm not expecting very many. Yes? Sure. Given the fact you didn't have a microphone, I'm going to repeat your question, if that's okay, which was, given the fact that so the largest trial I've ever run has an N of about 24 million, and therefore I didn't actually sit there and flip 24 million coins. And actually, the solutions I have a lot of RAs. Basically, sorry, that was I was an incredibly flippant answer. The real answer is you can do these things very simply using any statistical package or Excel, or you can get marbles as well if you wanted to. Yes?
Sorry, can you
Brandon,
yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah. Thank you.
We appreciate the enthusiasm, but it would be helpful if other people hear you.
So when you're running these iterations, say you're at a 5th iteration, do you ever compare one of the interventions with the original control group? Because that might be a rather interesting comparison also.
You could do, I think it would probably be interesting, I agree. I think I would probably have a very hard time selling to my policy colleagues and to ministers the idea that this thing which I told you we'd conclusively proven was less good, like a year ago, I'd like you to go back and try that again to satisfy my intellectual curiosity. So not yet. However, I can definitely see an argument where sort of eventually things that were control conditions before, things may change and therefore they may actually become part of the contemporary thinking again, therefore they'd be worth testing. I find it's difficult ethically to justify testing something which you know isn't going to work.
But I should also add that it's, we've presented a kind of stylized fact that we do one thing, it works, we roll that out, we then look for the next thing, we then look for the next thing. We would love to do that, but often policy making is not that simple. So often in reality it is possible to still observe the original control group some while afterwards. It kind of depends on the institutional landscape, really. There's another one there.
Just very quickly, just because we were talking yesterday about replication of tests, and surely this comment was about that you should replicate it again later to see if it really did work.
Should. So I think definitely, replication is definitely very important. It's slightly unclear whether or not I'm necessarily the best person to replicate my own work. And replication to me feels like repeating the exact same study as the first one in that sequence, rather than reintroducing the original control compared to a new treatment group, although I can definitely see why it would be. Quite often we do sort of winners stays on trials where we keep on one or two interventions which were in the first trial, and so that we can see that they're actually tracking relative to each other ordinarily at least as we move forward, because it's possible that these things were just flukes the first time around. But yeah. No, we think replication's really important. It's somewhat harder to do in a sample size of 25 million, or really easy to do depending on your perspective. Any further questions? No? Okay, excellent.
Oh, sorry, was there one there? Sorry, just wait until Chris will bring a microphone over to you. Thank you.
How do you take account of the fact that some results may be flukes?
We feel very lucky that some results may be flukes, otherwise I'd have no successes. So definitely some results may be flukes, and that's why it is important that studies get run over and over again, and that we properly robustness check everything we do. So I think we don't tend to do a great deal of replicating of our own work, just for the simple reason that that's generally not, so I'm not really an academic, and so that isn't my main objective function. We think it's important that replication does happen. However, I think, yeah, I sort of lost that train of thought. I don't have a very compelling answer. Raj has a compelling ansser.
I also have another point on this. So once you're rolling something out nationwide, it does become difficult to replicate, and you've got to hope to be pretty confident that this is not a fluke. I'm going to show you some examples of some stuff I've done later in education. We always start small, right? And the thing with starting small is you can replicate, and you can just check you didn't luck out. So a simple thing that I'm going to show you later, where we texted parents about a coming maths test, we did it once, it worked, great. And then we tried to do it again, then we tried to do it again. And before we start telling every school in the country this is a thing you should do, usually there's some small ones that we could try it a few times, or other academics could do the same. So there is a time lag between doing a small trial and going, look, this works, and actually some sort of national rollout. Policy is not that fast.
Yeah. In an ideal world, you want to randomize the order of the rollout, so you can basically have a trial based into the rollout as well, which would tend to limit the likelihood it's a fluke. Yes?
In your experience with behavioural economic interventions, how long should you run the trials for? So in the study that the case study that we're using, how could you account for the fact that maybe your intervention is more effective in the short term, but in the longer term, it might not be as effective as the control, potentially?
So that's definitely a live issue. I think Sir Richard said yesterday we don't do behavioural economics, so, but I think in general, what we would do is we talk to the people who know the field much better than we do. So, for example, if we're looking at an employment trial, we'd probably talk to colleagues at the Department for Work and Pensions who know how long people typically persist in employment for, how long sort of they consider an intervention to be, what their measure of success is. So they're not going to be, DWP will not consider it to be a success. They got a job and then they left it a week later. They'll have a measure like 6 months of sustained employment. And so that's really important to sort of look at and to find out the sort of almost the local context, where DWP is a word meaning local now. I also think it's sort of important to try and measure as much as possible with these kind of things, because in an employment trial, you can think of 100 DVs 100 outcome measures you'd like to look at. So it's not just did they get a job, but how well did that job pay? Because it could be that people getting a job after 10 weeks will have a job that pays significantly less than people who get a job after 20 weeks, and therefore actually maybe we wanted them to stay on the job market for longer and to search more and to find better jobs. So it's important to be nuanced about this, but as I said, like, local knowledge is really where we go. So I don't have a very strong sense of how long a thing should last by myself.
So I think one other thing to add is that as we go on, we're going to talk a lot more about designing a trial and understanding the context a lot more before you go into it. And there is no right answer for every single context. Can we just restrict questions just to the trial design issues? Because I know it's great that there's all loads of questions, but we're going to be talking about how there's a lot of complication, and this is not as simple as it first looks. And that's the whole point of the talk. So if there's any other questions about terminology, can we take those now? And otherwise, we might just keep it moving. Okay, great, okay. But any other questions that you've got, please keep them in your mind, because there will be more opportunities later. So having explained how trials work, and it sounds like, a lot of you guys are quite savvy to this already, we just thought we'd briefly discuss, the history of trials being used in policy. So they're very common in healthcare, as we'll discuss in a moment. But I think one of the big breakthroughs in the policy world was the evaluation of a policy called Scared Straight. Have any of you heard of Scared Straight? A few hands going up. Good. A few of you may even have seen a behavioural insights team presentation before, so that's great, because we use this example a lot. But in the 70s, it was very, very common in the US that if somebody had committed a minor crime, a minor misdemeanor, and they were like a reasonably young criminal, they would take them to a proper jail, a mean jail, and hang out with some proper mean criminals just for the day who would scare the living daylights out of them. This was made into a documentary which won an Academy Award, right? And I'm going to return to that in a moment. And you could see it. You could see these kids absolutely terrified of some enormous convict with tattoos everywhere, just terrified of them and told about what was going to go on in jail. This is a very popular, intuitive idea. This became increasingly popular to the point where it's being done all around the world. Okay? Eventually, someone did some randomized controlled trials and said, well, how about we get a control group and we get a treatment group and we compare what actually happened? And it turns out it's worse than useless. Okay? It's not just reducing, it's not even having no effect. The guys who were going into the jails and hanging out with the big criminals might have looked scared, but it actually made them more likely to commit crimes in the future, right? And just think to yourself for a moment, if you're working in policy, how many things are you working on that are intuitive, are just the received wisdom in the way you do things, and they seem completely right, but how much do you really know about whether they work? One interesting thing about Scared Straight is that there's going to be a brief competition now. Scared Straight, as I said, was a documentary, and what I like is great viewing. It's all on YouTube. You can find it without any problem at all. And it's all narrated by a famous 70s police cop. And you have an opportunity to win a signed copy of David Halpern's new book, Inside the Nudge Unit, which we've procured specially. And guesses are fine. That's absolutely fine. Does anybody know off the top of their head? Okay, I'm going to give you 3 options. First person to shout it out gets the book. It's that simple. Is it Columbo, Kojak, or Shaft? I heard someone say Columbo down here. There we go. All right. It is indeed Columbo. And I'm going to read out the inscription, because I had David do this especially, and I don't think he really understands why. And it's very much in keeping with the talk. Always think to yourself, if there's one more thing, it might be really important. So there you go. Congratulations. All right. Columbo was a very wise man, as we're going to discuss. So in health, it's very, very common. You wouldn't really think of, getting a drug or some treatment from a doctor that hadn't been tested in a randomized controlled trial. We just assume it. Very large number indeed of those. Social welfare and education, even back then, it's starting to kick off, but the numbers are still pretty low. Okay. BIT, and ever since Michael Sanders has sort of turned up like a bit of a tornado, have done over 200 in the last 5 years. And actually in this country we now have a number of what work centres. Some of you might know about these. And these centres have been established by government to tackle the biggest issues facing society. So they might be there's one called the Centre for Ageing Better. How do we help people age comfortably? There's others for crime. There's others for how healthcare systems should be run. Probably the one that's got the most profile is the Education Endowment Foundation. We're a fantastic organisation. I say that partly because they've given me funding, but they also are a fantastic organisation. And they've run over 100 trials since 2010. I think about 1 in 5 schools in the country are now participating in a trial. And what's amazing about this is when you used to speak to a school 4 or 5 years ago, and you would have to talk them through a trial right at the beginning, it was not an easy process, not easy at all. And now they're on the phone to me going, I'm slightly worried about your randomization strategy. So even the capacity building in that sector I mean, those are the maths teachers, but fine, that's great. It's still quite amazing what's, the cultural change which has happened there in a very short space of time. So you're all thinking now, great, terrific, I want to do a randomized control trial, I've got my policy idea, be it a work program for reoffenders or something else. And you think, okay, where can I learn how to do this? And you might go to the Behavioural Insights team website, and under Publications, you'll find Test, Learn, Adapt, which is a terrific document which talks you through the basics of running a trial. And you will find perhaps these 9 stages, and you go, okay, that looks manageable, might need a bit of help at some point. And really what this talk about is, hang on just a moment, right? So before we sort of race ahead and start identifying our interventions and getting really excited to see if our thing works, which is a temptation we all have, we all fall in love with our ideas a little bit, there's some really important steps you need to go through first. I'm just going to take a sip of water here, excuse me. That's step 1. Yes, you must always take a sip of water first. Okay, so before you even think about starting to do a trial, you of course need to be introduced to yet another acronym by the Behavioural Insights team, and this one is TEST, okay? And this is our project methodology. And it's not just enough for it to be an acronym, we also need some sort of fancy geometry and bright colours. Fairly simple. First you have to target what you're going after, then you have to explore the environment, then maybe you think of some ideas. After that goes on for quite a while, in a repetitive loop, only then do you come to trialling, okay? And I'm going to talk about how that helps to anticipate problems which maybe can be fixed. And later we'll talk about, even for all the goodwill in the world and all the testing, if that's a word, there might still be unknown unknowns, and we'll come to that later. So target. So we had a great question here earlier, and it was like, well, what kind of target should we be going after? Short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes. That's definitely a conversation you need to have with the trial, with the trial partner to find out what actually makes sense in that world. I think, so one thing that you mentioned, I'm probably going to go off a brief tangent and I'll try and keep it short. Sometimes you do hear this criticism of behavioural science or behavioural economics that, okay, well, you found an outcome in the short run, how do we know it works? My response is, this is a good problem to have, right? You're often in a world where even in the short run, we throw huge amounts of resources at something and we get nothing, right? So I completely agree, long-run evaluations are really important. And the sort of work that can now be done with tracking long-term education outcomes, for example, for an early years intervention, that's a crucial part of the story, and we definitely can't let that go. But it's certainly a nice position to be in going, oh, this thing worked, I wonder how long it's going to work for. But yeah, we're going to look for smart targets. Now, many of you will be civil servants, or I'm going to try not to spend too much time on management lingo, which I'm sure you will all have seen elsewhere, right? I'm sure most of you have seen this acronym. But often, notice that the objective we were going after before, how do we help ex-offenders going back into work, weren't really hugely specific about exactly what we were trying to do, who was going to do it, exactly whose behaviour are we talking about. Are we talking about the offenders or potential employers? Time frame is really important, and also what we're suggesting is realistic. Apologies for not reading those out in order, but I hope that's easy enough to follow. So a really good checklist, when often you can be sitting there and someone will say, yeah, we want tax collection services to be better. Okay, but what exactly do you mean? Whose behaviour are we going after, right? And often what you're doing when you're designing a trial is that you're something of a killjoy. Somebody has made a great speech about a noble ideal that everybody can get behind, and you're just there going, yeah, but exactly who, and when, and how, and is that going to happen, and how are we going to actually measure this, right? After that, it's important that you understand the data journey, all right? So you're going to go and visit some of the trial partners, if that's what you were doing, or if this is your own department, go and find the person who actually handles the data, and try and get a good sense of, let's say we are talking about a back-to-work program for offenders. What kind of data do we have in these guys? How much does their employment data sync up with their criminal justice data? And how will we actually know if they're turning up on the program? You need to know, from the moment they step in, who records it? Is there a unique identifier? Then does that go into another database? Do those databases understand each other? Now, when we asked for stories, okay, a lot of stories were just about, yeah, so we had this database, we did the randomization on the basis of that database, we then obviously did the intervention, we then have the outcomes. These two databases have no idea about each other at all. And this was only discovered after the event, right? Now, no one's going to make a film out of those stories, I don't think, right? It's just two databases that don't talk, but you need to anticipate it. The best example of it is one that Michael has. So, Michael?
Thank you. I don't need this, do I?
You don't need it.
No, it's all yours. So, as I said before, I am the biggest failure in the room, possibly the biggest failure in the country when it comes to randomized controlled trials. So this is a story of me failing. I'm Catholic, I should say, so I have this tendency to try and confess given the slightest opportunity. This was a study which I did with a large employer trying to get their employees to give money to charity. Some of you may have heard of it before, those of you who've sat with me for more than 10 minutes at a time. And they were a really great partner to work with. They said, okay, I want to give out sweets to every other investment banker. I want to randomly allocate emails going from the CEO. Can you do that? Like, yep, sure, we get randomization. We're pretty smart. We'll just do that for you. Like, okay, great. And at the end of the process, what you're going to do is you're going to give me the data so I can analyze it and I can work out who's given and that sort of thing. Like, yep, sounds great. So we run the trial, it goes really smoothly. Me and a dozen or so RAs descend on this employer for a day, run the experiment very, very quick, no long-term outcome measures because we're just taking money off of them. And then that night they send me a spreadsheet and I'm like, oh, brilliant, they sent me the data already. Get into the office next morning, I tell Owen, who's standing at the back of the room, our illustrious managing director, we're going to have results really, really soon. It's fantastic. Open up the spreadsheet. And what I've got is everybody who gave money, which is fantastic, but I don't have everybody who didn't give money, which is kind of important. And I don't know where they work, which means I can't tell what condition they were assigned to. So I go back to them and say, thanks so much for this. It's been great working with you. By the way, could I have the entire data set? No, we don't have that data set. That data set belongs to our HR department. We're the corporate social responsibility one. We can't do that. So after having told my boss that we're going to have results really soon, I'm like, okay, is there a way we can work our way around this? And they were, as I said, a really good partner. And so we spoke to the HR department. That's fine, just come in. You can sit here on a terminal. You can merge the two data sets together. It's a bit difficult because there's no real unique identifiers that can just merge them across. But the service which we're going to be using, you can only actually access it from a couple of terminals in the building, and they're in use during the day. So what I'll need you to do is, after work, after we've closed, is come in and sit here, and we'll have a nice security guard standing behind you to make sure we're not stealing your data. And you can just transcribe this data from one column to another. And so for 2 weeks, Owen may have noticed I was slightly more haggard even than usual, because I'd been up all night. I worked my day, and then I went and I had to sit in a computer in a small room with a security guard watching me, which is slightly intense. If any of you have ever been through customs in America, that's pretty much like that, but for 8 hours a night, for about 10 nights in a row. And finally, I got my data out. Had I known in advance this was going to happen, I might have A, promised less, but B, probably tried to work out a way of gathering that data automatically as we went through. So, basic stupid mistake. I asked for data, and they gave me data. But I really wasn't specific enough in what it was I was asking for. Okay.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, so we have another example from the target section of our framework. So this is a small child. This is a small child trying to do a maths test. So this story comes from Professor Anna Vignoles, who's joining us for the Education RCT session later, and she's a great speaker, so I'd urge you all to come if you have no plans. But Anna was evaluating a new approach to improving numeracy for young kids. If any of you have 5-, 6-year-old kids, you might suddenly think, okay, that's interesting, how's that going to work? And I think there was an assumption through a lot of it that, okay, at the end of the year, we'll just give them the test, which obviously 6-year-old kids do. It's not really that simple for 6-year-old kids, right? So actually, the most reliable evaluator they had of numerical ability was for the kids to sort different coloured counters into different piles according to one-to-one questions. There was 500 counters which needed to be sorted into different colours for every single test, and there was 4,000 kids in the trial, right? And I think they suddenly looked at it and went, oh, okay, that would be interesting, how are we going to do that? Anna was very clever about it and recruited her children into it and effectively, sounds like ran a slave labour camp for about 2 weeks, right? So, and eventually collected all of the data, and that was just the beginning baseline data. Of course, in 9 months they had to do the outcome data as well, right? And it's very, very easy to overlook these kind of things, but if you can think a little bit at the beginning about exactly what we're going to go after, does that data exist now? If it doesn't, we're going to have to collect it, and what's that going to involve, right? I know some of this stuff sounds pretty routine and fairly obvious, but it catches us all out. The next thing we want to talk about is explore. Explore just means spending as much time as you possibly can with the trial partners and understanding really what goes on in their world. And just a simple thing I want to point out here is that even guys that you've worked with for a very, very long time, you might think you know what they do for a living, right? Of course you do. That's Derek, he works in accounts. I know what accounts do. But do you really know what Derek's day involves from start to finish? And just think for a moment, think about what you do. I don't know if you're a policymaker or a researcher, and think about what do your friends and family think you do? All right, so because I once told my mum that the behavioural insights team were based in the Treasury, she still pretty much thinks I'm the Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? She doesn't really understand exactly what goes on here. And a lot of my friends think I'm something like a cross between, I mean, this is my fault, right? I've kind of told them that my life is like West Wing. Michael, what do your friends and family think you do?
So my dad has been telling his friends, which are thankfully few in number, for the last 4 years that I work for the Behavioural Analysis Unit at the FBI, like in Criminal Minds. So I go around and I say, he's a sociopath of this type, then I shoot them.
So this may be familiar to a lot of you guys, that you're researching a thing, no matter how long you've been researching it for, even your closest friends are looking at you and they glaze over, they're thinking about what they're doing on the weekend. And we're all doing that. We all have these prior prejudices about what we think other people do for a living. Even if you're working in education, you might not really know what a teacher's day involves. So you spend as much time as you can there, you show that you care, and you personally experience what you can. Now, I don't know if any of you were lucky enough to see Bob Cialdini talk yesterday, but this is probably the favourite story of all the ones that we were given. So Bob was trying to get more people to donate blood, okay? Big policy aim, everybody loves the aim, how do we get more people to donate blood? Bob's a very experienced, very eminent researcher, and he's recruited some trial partners, but every single time he thinks the project is just about to happen, the person in charge seems to find some reason for the thing not to happen. And as you may have seen, Bob, his whole area of expertise is about persuasion. So he gets together with his RAs and they go, right, what cunning behavioural science techniques can we use to persuade these guys to give us the thumbs up for the project? And still they're unsuccessful. And they're at their wit's end, and they've been in yet another hour meeting going, why are they just not doing it? They go outside for a quick break. A junior member of staff at the blood bank comes up to him and says, by the way, I think, we've checked and it looks like none of you have ever given blood, right? So immediately, sleeves went up, off you go, donated blood, right? Now, most of the time, I really hope you're not actually going to have to give blood, right? But obviously, it's a metaphor, right? I guess everyone can see it. There's a couple of things that go on here. I mean, first of all, most of the people, doing the jobs and they're at this conference, they really do care about the policy area they're working in, right? But we talk about it so often sometimes that maybe when we're talking with trial partners, we're not always fully communicating just how much we do care about it. And we do really believe that the work they're doing is important. Always take the chance to convey that if you possibly can. And secondly, it's just a really good idea to understand, to actually go through the process that you're trying to encourage other people to do. If you're trying to encourage other people to give blood, do you know how scary it is? Do you know how big the needles are? Do you know what they say to you beforehand? The best thing you can possibly do is go and do it yourself, okay? And we try and bring that to every single project that we're doing at Behavioural Insights team now. Wherever possible, we go and experience the intervention if we can. Another example, sometimes you have a good idea, and it's a great idea, and you're so excited about doing the trial, and you've checked the target, and they have the data, and you can even know how to do the randomization, and everyone's positively euphoric about all this. And you haven't really asked, but are people already doing this and you're not really looking for it? So when I first started Behavioural Insights team and we were trying to get some education projects going, one thing we really wanted to do was take some stuff which had been done in the US, which is making it easier for kids from low-income backgrounds to apply to university. One thing they did is they just paid the application costs. So in this country we have, I think it's a £25 application fee. And we thought, well, £25 might be hard to come by that week. How about the school pays it? The kid doesn't have to go home and ask for a check or anything like that. And then they sort of think, well, I might as well apply. No financial cost to it. Michael, why don't you tell everyone what happened?
Sure. So we convinced the Department for Education to help us with the trial, which is a great feeling. We convinced, I think, about 600 schools to take part in the trial. We gave them the money to give to the students to pay for their fees. And then we also gave them some extra money to administer it because they said that was something they would probably need. And then, thankfully, someone in DFE thought we'll do some qualitative research. We'll survey the schools to see how it's going and see what adherence is like. And it transpired that 72% of the schools in our treatment group were adhering, which is pretty good. It's some attrition, some non-adherence, but it's okay. The problem was that 60% of the schools in the control condition were also adhering to our treatment. So this was something they were going to do anyway, and when someone from the DFE or from the Behavioural Insights team called up and said, hey, please be part of our trial, we'll give you some money to do this thing, they thought, yeah, doing that already, I can use the money. Times are tough. And they took the money and they did exactly what they were going to do anyway. So we were basically stuffed. Technical term there.
And I think really the lesson that I learned was I got so excited about doing the trial, really, I skipped a stage where actually I just went to schools around the time that kids were applying to university and actually just looked at what happens. And some of the stuff you're only going to really see in person, which is that you just notice that a few of the kids don't hand over any checks. It's all been taken care of. Very hard to see that from afar. So what is the goal of this explore phase? You want to understand the perspective of the end user, and the best way to do that is to do what they do. The same goes for every single person actually delivering the service, right? And this isn't just, it's a temptation we all have sometimes. You might go into an organisation and go, I want to do this thing. The boss says, yeah, we can do that. My staff will do that. That's all great. And then you sort of think, okay, I've done it. I've got them on side. Probably not. I mean, what's actually happened is it's always going to be the workers on the ground who actually have to implement the thing, right? So unfortunately, like I said, I've picked education to work in. So usually I insist on going to staff meetings myself. Staff meetings invariably at 6:30 in the morning, right? And despite this week, I'm not an early riser. But you have to be there. You have to come bearing cake, smiles, enthusiasm, and passion, and watch them go about their day and see how your intervention is actually going to work for them. You need to understand the whole system. Next, you can come up with some solutions. Michael's going to talk you through some of these.
Sure. So this is stab vest for those people who are from America and therefore aren't accustomed to the idea of people killing people with knives. It's what you do if you can't lay your hand on a gun. So this is a stab vest which our colleague Rory Gallagher, who is the only person I believe who we have a really good point estimate on how charismatic he is. He's based on a trial we did which we had awful issues of contamination. I can estimate reasonably precisely with a p-value of less than 0.01 that Rory, being in a job centre for a few weeks, has a short-term impact of increasing offload from benefits by about 2 percentage points. So we should bottle Rory and send him around. He's just that charming. He's around the conference, so you should all try to meet him and work out how to bottle that stuff. So as with this trial, we're trying to get people to pay, people who are delinquent with their court fines, to pay their fines on time, or just to pay them before the bailiffs come and kick their door in and take all of their stuff. And so in anticipation of this, Rory, I think because he thought it was going to be a bit fun, said he would go out on a bailiff's visit to visit the houses of the people who are delinquent in their fines, who are about to have their stuff and taken away. So he gets up, goes to Dover at about 5 o'clock in the morning, dons his stab vest, takes a few selfies, I'm sure, and then they go and they kick a door in. I think they knock. And then the person opens the door, and the first thing Rory sees as soon as he's through the door is a huge pile of letters, unopened, which are last demand for this. You've been pre-approved for a credit card, and this is Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service. You have a fine delinquent, please pay it. These people are typically having, being delinquent on your fines doesn't happen in isolation financially to the rest of the world. And people who lead disorganized lives just don't check their post as often. When they come into the courts to be processed and checked through, what we do discover is they all have mobile phones, because when they're being read their rights and when the magistrate is telling them what they've done wrong and saying they're going to get a bigger fine, they're all sat there playing Angry Birds or texting or whatever it is young people do on their phones these days. And so, well, we know they're constantly checking their mobile phone. We know they aren't checking their letters. So why don't we just text them? Because we have their mobile phone numbers. And so from this sort of 5:30 a.m. expedition to Dover wearing a stab vest, his intervention, which has proven to be hugely successful, has been replicated several times now, sort of was born in that moment, with the sound of a door being kicked in, which is how most of my ideas come.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Mark.
Okay, so do the field work and then use it. Another one, I think we'll keep it moving actually, so we might just tell this one briefly. So Dan Ariely told us about a time that he was trying to direct people towards financial products that he thought would be more beneficial for them. And it was all set up, the trial partner's ready to go, everything looks great, everyone's very happy. Somebody has to go through the small print, right? That's not a direct screenshot. No one's really inspired by 20 pages of terms and conditions of your different intervention arms, but somebody needs to do it. Luckily, Dan did, and discovered that pretty much every single intervention they were recommending actually had hidden fees which would cost the person money, right? Great thing that they discovered it then, all right? Okay, again, they could have bought the trial, but that's definitely worth doing. Does anybody know what this picture is? No? Some bewilderment? Okay. That's the first ever car, which I'm amazed that I've never Googled before in all of my many procrastination hours. But this quote is beautiful. Your first try will be wrong, budget and design for it. And this is not true just of trials and designing interventions for trials. Surely this is true for all policy making. As Michael said, even if we do really well the first time out, with the reoffender work program, do we really now think we have the optimal policy? Clearly not, right? Very unlikely. So really what you want to do, and this partly goes to the question the gentleman raised earlier about replication, is that not only are you replicating, you're not finished once you get a decent result. You need to always look at how could we have done this better. There's many, many examples of this. One very brief one is I had an intervention where turns out if you're physically active just before doing some sort of memory test, you tend to perform better, right? So we thought, well, can we integrate this into what goes on in primary schools and have kids jumping about as part of their maths and English lessons? We spend a lot of time doing qualitative work with teachers, and we said, do you want like a set of laminated cards, which we give you, and these are your lesson plans? And they said, no, 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 we're professional teachers, we would prefer to have, just let us build it into our lessons ourselves. In the end, we ran a very, very small trial, letting them do that. About 2 months later, it turns out, yeah, we don't really know what to do. What would be really good is some kind of like laminated cards or something like that. Fine, I completely understand. I've made that mistake all the time, where my ability to do something in the future is nowhere near what it actually is. So your first try will be wrong. Just expect that, right? And that's part of the enjoyable process, and try and build some stuff in that can collect data along the way. And here's another lesson from the field. Again, I'm going to try and keep the management stuff to a minimum. But again, look for smart interventions. Here's an example of one which is not smart, even though it's a great idea. And this comes out of an actual conversation, a real project that I've done with Simon Burgess and Todd Rogers, who are also speaking at the education session later. And we thought, yeah, how can we just get parents more informed? And we just sort of go, yeah, it'd be good if they just knew about a test, right? But we don't really know, and this is what it looks like, so we've even decided the wording. And great, let's all go back and feel pleased with ourselves because this trial's going to happen. And then it sort of occurred to us, well, hang on a minute. Yeah, I mean, like, how are we actually going to send these texts? How are we going to get these phone numbers? And you can see the other questions there. A colleague of mine who worked with me for about 2.5 years on this, James, is over there. If anybody's interested in just how complicated this thing can be, James has infinite stories which will go on for many, many hours. And what's interesting about it is it's just one sentence, which sounds like a great thing. And many, many times, the great speakers we have around here were going, we had this idea, we did the thing, control group did this, treatment group did this, and of course we just moved on with our lives. And you don't see everything that went on behind it quite often. And it's often a lot. And this is what went into it. We like using these swim lane diagrams. So this is one that James made. We like to say, right, who's doing what and when are they doing it? And you suddenly go from one sentence, which sounds really obvious, into a multi-stage process which really helps you clearly understand who is doing what when. And it's a great way of flagging if there's stuff that you haven't thought through maybe as clearly as you could have done. This is a really simple intervention. Oh, sorry. And also, you want your interventions to be smart, right? So much as I said, can you actually know that it happened? Who's going to do it? Is it realistic? I mean, are we asking teachers or whoever to do something really, really implausible in a very busy day? And exactly when is it going to happen? Even for a simple intervention, you can see it's more complicated than you think. And for a complicated intervention, it can look something like this. I'm not going to talk you through this. You're all going to be spared that one, right? But just so you know, it grows. But I think this is a thing of beauty, and we're all very proud of it, the Behavioural Insights team, and we look forward to much of that being incredibly naive, and we had to change plan. Another thing we like to do is we're running a lot of trials in colleges at the moment, and we like to monitor what every single college has done in every single minor trivial thing that we're asking. This might be something you all do as a matter of course as professionals, and that's great. But even if we just ask them for some initial exploratory data, we just want to know what is the state of play with that. Because it can be overwhelming dealing with 40 different trial partners at a time. And if you want to know who's doing what, split them up, allocate them to different people, build personal relationships there, and just watch every single thing they're doing. And if you're really feeling quite entrepreneurial, you can start color coding them depending on how well you think they're doing. I enjoy the color coding. I think you're getting a sense of the sort of things I enjoy now. All right, that's fine. This thing is going to take time. You're going to go around in circles a little bit. That's part of the process. And then you get on to actually running a trial. Any questions about any of the stuff I've been talking about at all before we move on to actually running the trial? Yeah, can you get the microphone there again, please, Brandon?
Thank you. At this stage, before you move on to the trial, is that when you would start to think about what sort of direction you expect and what sort of size of effect that you think the outcome would be?
Yeah, I think one thing we've tried not to do, and I hope we've been successful, is get too bogged down in the statistical side of what's going on. But you're completely right. As you're going along, you're going to have a rough sense of how much is this thing going to work. And if it's going to be a really, really big effect, then you don't need that many people. If you think what you're going to do is going to help, but only a little bit, then you need a huge number of people. And that's definitely part of the process as you're going along, right? And you've got to think, if we're going to go for such a small effect that we need 5,000 people, is it possible to even recruit that? And that's part of the smart intervention side, I suppose. Yeah, sorry, Chris? Sorry. Thanks, Brandon. You can jog over.
Just going back to the explore topic.
Sure.
Could you talk a bit more about, in a little bit more detail, the process that you go through in the actual field work? So say going to Dover or going into a school, what do you document? How many people do you send? What things do you look for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm going to give you a slightly irritating answer and then try and make it less irritating, which is that it kind of depends on the situation. It depends on where you're going. We work in so many different policy areas, but we certainly start with the service. We certainly start with, like, what is the user journey? That's the best place to start, okay? And then initially you go there for a bit of a visit and you're actually just going to meet who the people you're going to be working with. That's just going to take a couple of people. And you're going to be probably given a sort of tour. And you probably need to do that 2 or 3 times before you start to get the nuances and what's really going on. Because often, if you go into a school or a job centre or a hospital, they'll give you the tour which they give visitors from outside, especially the tour that they might give Westminster government officials. And over time, you notice that a form is being filled out in a slightly different way than you first thought. But you can't really get to the point where you're inquiring about their procedures until they've built up a bit of trust there and they're happy to talk to you about the pressures they're really facing. I would say you start off with a couple of people and there's nothing very formal about it. You're just saying, we're just coming in to meet you and say hello and have a chat with you. I'm not a trained qualitative researcher, so I don't really have the formal language for a lot of this stuff, right? But then the other things that you want to do is start getting descriptive data of the people that are using the services, because they might sort of tell you, oh, we really service the low-income community. They might not, right? So again, this is part of understanding the data that you have. So it is going to depend on the procedure that you're looking at, but always, I mean, guys are going out in stab vests, guys are going out to immigration centres. We always just try and turn up in person, always. Any others? One there.
Yeah, thanks for that. I have a question about, before you start, the extent to which you go into formal or otherwise agreements with your partners.
Yeah.
My experience is you want to tie things down, but there's a point at which you maybe scare people off.
Yeah, I mean, this is true in many walks of life, I guess. But I mean, yeah, I mean, you make it clear that you want to do a trial, and you see how keen they are about it, right? And if you sense that they have some reservations, I think giving them a 4-page memorandum of understanding of everything that's expected of them might be a bit keen, right? And it's going to take a bit longer. And, you know, you guys are all intelligent human beings. You're going to have to gauge it as you're going along. One thing I'm going to talk about a little bit later is even when someone says yes, they're happy to go along with it, it depends on the institutional framework you're working in. There's very little to stop somebody from just walking away at any point anyway. So, you know, that's a separate issue that we're going to talk about. So I would sort of suggest, at the moment, don't scare people with huge documents of all the stuff they're going to do. Start off just meeting them, and then work out even who would read that document and what would they want that document to contain and tailor it a little bit. But I would say less to start off with.
I would caveat that, if I may.
Yeah, please do, Michael.
So I think it depends a lot on your objective function. So we will typically be working with a partner where we really want to run the trial and we're completely dedicated to it. And also we really want to work with this particular partner for one reason or another. So because we've been told to by a government department or that kind of thing. And so we will tend to, like, as Raj says, take a very softly approach. In the event that you were, for example, a graduate student and you were looking to run a field experiment, I would encourage people to skip more to the end of that process, because you want to know whether people are going to get scared and run away, because you don't really have a lot of time to invest in them. And if you're in a, for want of a better phrase, target-rich environment where there are lots of schools or firms you can work with, or departments or whoever, then you really want to isolate the ones who are actually likely to go ahead with it pretty quickly, because you don't have time to waste.
Thanks, Michael. One more over here. We're about halfway through the time. We're doing all right.
Hi, can I ask what you do when you can't experience an intervention yourself? So, for example, it may be something around weight loss and you may well be within target BMI yourself, or it may be smoking cessation, and again, you don't smoke, so do you substitute that with like first-time user accounts, or what do you do?
Yeah. So randomly divide vices among the team. It's right. I'm fat and he's lazy.
So we do need to recruit some more smokers. That is a problem we have. So, yes, you're right, you can't do absolutely everything, but I think just go and watch what actually goes on. So if I mean, let's just take the example that you're given, giving up smoking. That we might try and work out, okay, where do people do well at giving up smoking, and where do people not give up well at smoking? We'll go and talk to some academics who've worked in that field for a long time and sort of say, people are actually not bad at doing it at work because they can hide themselves at work. It tends to be at the pub. So we'll do what any diligent researcher would do and go to the pub, right? And then we go and observe what's going on there, talk to some guys who are smoking. Are you trying to give up? How are we getting on? At what point do you think just sort of, that's the sort of thing you could do. You are going to have to improvise sometimes. We wouldn't really encourage someone to take up smoking. But yeah, we do what we can. There's a couple of others. I should also say that in the interest of sort of finishing this thing on time, it's great there's lots of questions. We'll take one more now. So it's just that gentleman there in the blue shirt. And then after that, we'll keep it moving. But there's lunch immediately afterwards. And please do pull me and Michael aside and ask us all the others. Yeah.
Yeah, so we've had experience of running RCTs in schools where the school's main interest is that as many kids as possible benefit from the intervention.
Yeah.
And therefore saying, well, there's a group that won't, means that we have to make promises about following up the RCT with making it available to the other group, which adds a lot to the time and cost, which is sometimes possible, sometimes not possible. I was wondering whether you'd had experience of the same thing and how you dealt with it.
Yeah, we've experienced exactly that. And in fact, you brought me very nicely onto the next stage. And there's a beautiful slide we've created for... We haven't spoken before, right? Because people can think that's suspicious. But that is an important issue and the one we will discuss shortly. Sorry, I know there's lots of other questions. We will just chat to you guys afterwards. And actually, this is a point I thought, in case there are no questions, I would invite stories of your own. But this has been great. Everyone's been very forthcoming. Now we move on to the actual trial. Michael's going to chat here, so we're about halfway through, so it's moving. But you can...
Great. So if you're going to run a trial and you're not an academic, and even if you are academic, you may want help of some kind. And so we now have the What Works team, which our super boss, David Halpern, who many of you may have encountered in the last 2 days, is also the government's national advisor for What Works. So he leads the What Works team in Cabinet Office. And we now have a cross-government trial advice panel, which means anybody from policy can basically go and request help from this panel, and they'll provide access to a collection of fantastic academics with a great deal of experience in this field. And then a subgroup of the panel will work you through the process of designing your trial, which is really great. It's also good, in my experience, having been a junior person for most of my life, and still in many ways, except the premature aging thing. Other than that, is if you're a junior academic, going to this trial advisory panel means there will be people there who can help you, who have been through everything and who have the scars on their back to prove it. And if you're an academic, it's a pretty good source of policymakers who are really interested in running randomized control trials. So you can cold call every government department, every civil servant in the entire world, and hope you find the one person in the Department for Education in your country or in the UK who wants to run a trial. Or you can go and sit on the trial advisory panel where these people will literally come to you and beg for help. It just feels like it's, as I said, a target-rich environment, and so it just seems like a great thing to be part of. I believe that they do always want more members, so I'm plugging that now. So this is an interesting sentence. It's not entirely a reflection on my PhD experience, but academics are broadly supportive and a good resource they're definitely a good resource for advice. Supportive is 50-50. Just checking the audience for... Yeah. Yeah, so if you're dealing with a problem that is interesting, which basically means if you're dealing with a problem, there'll be an academic out there who's dedicated most of their adult life to working on it. Find out who they are, and then email them. And they'll probably be really happy to talk to you, because to be honest, having been at a lot of dinner parties where I've been trying to talk to people about my research, I would kill for someone who even stayed awake past the first 5 minutes to be trying to do that, let alone someone who's coming to me saying, please help me with my policy problem. So that's... I think, yeah, academics are a really good source. And obviously there's this great organization called the Behavioral Insights team. Their head of research is a bit wacky, but other than that, they're a really great bunch of people. And we are genuinely very happy to talk to people all the time about trials. In fact, just try and stop us. So I have a 15-minute rule, which is that anybody who emails me, michael.sanders@behaviораlinsights.co.uk, I will give 15 minutes of my time to talk about whatever problem with trial design or with behavioral science or anything they want. My expectation generally is if I say that in front of a group of people, about 10% of them at most will respond, but I'm willing to be tested by you all trying it. So let's see how that goes. So yeah, just email us, and Raj also has an email address. I'm not sure whether he's...
It comes up at the end, yeah.
Yeah. This is me, yeah? Yeah, so then you get on to the finally, you're actually going to run an RCT. I'm not going to go through this in great depth because there's this amazing paper which was written by Owen Service, by David Torgerson from the York Trials Unit, by Laura Haynes, now of Capita, ex of the Behavioural Insights team, and Ben Goldacre, ex of the Guardian and the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and currently at the University of Oxford. I think I've done the full affiliation list, which you can read and sort of gives you a really good background in these things. Am I still going? Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that we have learned is that quite often you have a small sample. Even if you are dealing with a large organization, like for example a country, they're very reluctant to let you have their entire apparatus to play with at once. And if you ask them, say, can I have all 700,000 school children who are in year 9 at the moment? They will probably say no. They might, if they're particularly giving, say you can have 5,000 of them. If they're more normal, they might say, okay, we actually have 300 who you can use for your trial. And so when you're dealing with that kind of situation, what we find is a really good piece of practice is just to bundle as much stuff together that you think might work and just throw it at the sample. The reason being, your first experiment with a sample of 300 in which you test something that isn't terribly mechanistically interesting, but which you're pretty confident is going to work because you've bundled a whole bunch of stuff together, you've pulled out all the stops. That's much more likely to succeed because you've bundled everything together, because if you throw enough drugs at the wall, eventually the patient will get better or die. We'd probably not think about that one. And then when you go back to them and say, hey, we've done this thing and it worked really well, please give me a much larger sample so I can actually test the underlying mechanism so we can enhance our knowledge, you're much more likely to get that second trial if the first one's been successful. It's also from a policy perspective, quite often we're not that interested, bluntly, in mechanisms. What we're interested in what works. It's why they're called the what works team. So how do we make our policy objectives come to life? How do we improve things? And so bundling interventions doesn't seem that harmful. The one health warning I would place on that is we did a study for with the Department for Health and Public Health England and the National Health Service Blood and Transfusion Service and Transplant Service, I think. I get periodically confused as to who the trial partner was there, and it's important that I mention them, in which we were trying to encourage people to stop smoking. And we actually had a large enough sample that we could test about 6 different interventions, and we can test every single combination of them. So we had a fully factorial design. And what we found, which I wasn't expecting, was when you bundle enough of these things together, they all stop working. And it's pretty much a linear decline. After you've had 3 behavioral interventions at one time, the 4th one, the 5th one, the 6th one, they're just like confusing you. You're just adding social norms, and here's a prominent messenger, and I don't know, something else. I should probably know what the behavioral interventions are. And so, yeah, there is a health warning in the bundling. Bundling doesn't necessarily always work. It's worth thinking about the context. Are people going to get information overload? And so that story is actually going to be in Shlomo Bonacci's book when he has it available to sign again. So bundling we think is really important. If you haven't got a problem with your sample size, then we would generally encourage you to run as many interventions as you can, because that maximizes the chance you're going to learn something and maximizes the chances that something's going to work. When I say as many arms as you can, I wouldn't say, so this is a broader point on power, is looking for the lab experimental literature is a really bad way of doing power calculations, because anything that you find in the lab, almost by definition, have a large sample size, and you have almost complete control in the lab. There are lots of interventions which replicate really well from lab to field. The effect sizes do not typically translate that well. So we would typically power ourselves to detect incredibly small effects. And the way to think about that is, what is the smallest effect size about which I can get excited? If I can get 1% more people back into work, that sounds pretty good. 0.5%, that still sounds pretty good. 0.001%, that probably doesn't sound like it's going to get me out of bed in the morning. And so design your trial to detect the smallest thing you can be excited about. If you're thinking about a policy trial, it's quite often easy to think about, this is an intervention that costs a certain amount of money. Government expects a return on its investment in terms of social good. There are thousands and thousands of economists in government who do cost-benefit analysis for that exact purpose. If you can't detect an effect that is large enough that it would justify the intervention continuing to exist, then actually there's no point bothering. So design your trial in that way, but generally test as many things as you plausibly can do. So randomization, as we explained at the beginning, is a very easy thing to do. All you need is 25 million RAs with coins, and then you're sorted and you're set to go, or you can just press go and stata and it randomizes the whole thing for you. However, it's actually quite a bit more difficult to maintain. So you randomize people like that, and that all seems like it's going really well. And then you're confronted by this reality here, which the gentleman at the back has pointed out, which is that a teacher who's been told to intervene on only half of the class, deliver this intervention to half the class and not the other half, is suddenly confronted by the happy, smiling, and enthusiastic faces of some young people, and they're training to basically help people, which I don't have as an economist, No, mostly economists. Awkward. They're training to help people as a teacher kicks in, and it's very difficult for them not to intervene on people, which means you still have to start thinking about what level should we randomize at? How do we prevent this kind of thing from happening where everybody ends up being treated because the student or the teachers have a really strong idea that this is going to help the students to learn better, and so they really want to give it to everybody right away. So I have a good story, which is another one of my failings, where we did what's called a waitlist design, which is basically what you described, where we give the intervention to half the people, and then we promise we'll give the intervention to the other half later on. And we ran this trial, which was trying to boost applications to university among low-income children. And what we discovered was the intervention made things significantly worse. So in the control condition, about 40% of people were going to apply to university, and in the treatment group, about 35%. So I did an intervention which I made the world the worst place by doing that. And I was then able to go back to my partner and say, good thing we didn't do that to everyone at the start, otherwise your figures would have gone through the floor. And so when I'm talking about waitlist designs with schools, I'm like, why can't we just give everybody everything right away? It's nice to be able to roll that story, and you guys can roll out that story and say, this idiot called Michael Sanders who did this thing, and it failed miserably, so we should do a waitlist design, and we should randomize, because you can't tell what's going to go wrong. We were just giving them information about the returns to university. We had no reason to think it was going to go wrong, and yet it did, because we actually don't have great intuition for how these things work. And so what you can do to sort of try and limit this contamination problem is do randomization at the level of a cluster. These houses, instead of being individuals, they're houses or schools or that sort of thing. In the example, they're actually schools. And so everybody in a given school will then receive the same intervention, or not the same intervention. And that's how you can do that and get around that problem. You do lose quite a lot of statistical power, so you need a much larger sample size in terms of ends, but it is quite often much easier to control.
Thank you. Okay, so, and one other thing to sort of consider is that you just can't be too attentive at the start. So we have some examples where we have found, for example, we've done some work in job centres, we come up with a new intervention, and one thing which is quite difficult is you're trying to convince the trial partners to come and get involved and work with you, and you're convincing them that what you've got is going to help. And it's a very fine line to convince them that what you're saying is good, and they shouldn't just immediately roll out to absolutely everybody, and not one that we've quite mastered. And some work that we did in job centres, Sam Haynes, who led on this, we came up with some stuff, and the staff were really enthusiastic, and that was great. They all wanted to do it. And Sam just sort of popped by at the beginning just to see how they're getting on with it, and saw the intervention being carried out on the control group, who, of course, are not supposed to receive it at all. And Sam was going, okay, well, you need to not do that, right? And he also just sort of said to them, okay, so, how come you did that? And we sort of thought, they said, oh, we thought that bit didn't really matter, because they're just the control group, so they're not really that important. And so even though you've had these conversations many times, the perception in somebody's mind might still be different. What was also really interesting is they sort of said, we actually just wanted to practice for the other guys, which also made us realise that probably we should have done more work at the beginning. We should have prototyped it and given everybody a chance to have a go on it once with guys who aren't even in the trial. And maybe we were a bit lacking as well, just in the initial exploratory work we should have done. So, when you're starting a new intervention, first of all, give them lots of support when they're prototyping, so you make them sure that they know that you're there to help, right? And also, just make sure you front load a bit of resource right at the beginning, because that's when the questions are going to be. So the stuff James has done for me on, texting parents, at the beginning, it was a huge amount of work because everybody was doing something for the first time. And then as time goes on, many of these guys are just doing it themselves, and it's absolutely fine. Again, a way of flagging people who need help is this big spreadsheet thing, and I won't take up too much time with that. And also, really what you're trying to do is trying to encourage the people participating in the trial to do what we want them to do. And luckily, the Behavioural Insights team has a whole framework for encouraging certain kinds of behaviours. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but one example, which Richard was talking about a lot yesterday, if you want someone to do something, make it easy, right? So, have you really done every possible thing you can do to make your trial partner's job easier? They're often really, really busy themselves. If there's an additional bit of data that you need collecting, have you made that a simple process for them? I'm not going to go through all the rest of them, but it is really worthwhile almost thinking of encouraging proper implementation of the experiment as a policy problem in itself to use behavioural science for. You should expect and plan for attrition. We've already spoken a little bit about, you should always assume some of these guys at some point, despite being hugely enthusiastic, at some point are going to go, yeah, I've kind of lost interest in this, and just to sort of disappear off the map. If you're lucky, you might get an email saying, you know, it's not you, it's me. I feel we've grown apart. You know, like best case scenario, you might get that. And of course, you can try and turn it around. Sometimes it's possible, quite often not. And you should anticipate at the start. And this is a slide which we don't really need here. Okay. And we'll try and finish it a little bit early, so those who do have questions which require more involved specific answers just have the time to talk to us. Donald Rumsfeld, I'm sure everybody recognises him. You all have posters of him up on your wall at home, no doubt. But he did say one of the most beautiful things ever about unknown unknowns, and James is smiling wryly to himself, I'm sure, because I went on about this on an almost daily basis. You can do all of this stuff, right? You can do everything. You can spend weeks in a school to the point where it just becomes weird and you're trying to understand exactly what's going on there. But there is always going to be stuff that just nobody could see coming, right? That happens, it's real. Of course, this is not just true of trials, this is true of your policies that you're implementing even without trials. At least this way we might get some good outcome data at the end. But we have a couple of fun stories about the unknown unknowns, although they certainly weren't fun at the time. One, for example, so I work a lot with Todd Rogers at Harvard and Simon, and Todd has tried to instill in me a state of near constant paranoia, right? And that took about 6 months for him to bring that into me, and he says, right, I've now outsourced my paranoia to you. You constantly worry about the stuff that's going wrong, I'm going to go to sleep. And it's been a very effective strategy for him. And you can talk about the stuff that went right later this afternoon, so, you know, happy endings and all that. But one thing we did, we were trying to text parents when kids hadn't submitted their homework. There's a very elegant technological solution that came up to this. Teachers are registering when the kids haven't done their homework. We connected it to the texting software, and this thing would just go out, and it would be beautiful. It was so elegant. We were delighted. We prototyped it. James sat in a school for a while and sort of said, OK, so it would work like this, and I would press this button, it would do it. Everything worked fine. Then we went live in about 30-odd secondary schools across the country, and suddenly I noticed I had about 4,000 emails, and I thought, all right, something appears to have happened here. Turns out if there was an old version of software on some computer somewhere on the premises, the system would get confused and send a text out saying, your kid has not done their homework, to pretty much every kid, right? And you're sort of thinking, all right, interesting. Let's sort that one out. And in the end, it was fine. You know, most of the time, you send a quick apology, we're testing out a new system. Every now and again, you've got a parent who wants to give you an earful. That's a great opportunity, right? Obviously, I got them to talk to James, so I convinced him it was a great opportunity. But you've basically, you know, even if something goes wrong, if things work out all right, you've got somebody who really wants to talk to you about the intervention you're trying. Get them on the phone. At the very least, it's polite just to sort of like let them talk about it. Once they've let off a bit of steam, you can sort of go, and what do you think of the idea in general if we'd managed to get the thing to work properly? Oh yeah, what school are they in? How's that? You can get all sorts of additional information from people, even when stuff goes wrong. And another great example of this, where it was turned around, and Sally, who was sitting in the corners, now sort of disappeared again to prepare for the education session later. She was running a trial in some pretty rough high schools in Chicago, right? I mean, seriously hard places to go and try stuff. And they were offering kids, I think it was $20 to improve on their previous test score. And so what would happen is, because the mechanism they were using here was not just the incentive, but loss aversion, which you may have heard about, that giving them the $20 afterwards is nowhere near as powerful as giving them the $20 first and saying, if you don't do it, you have to give it back, right? So that's the mechanism they were trying to give. So that meant they give the kids the money at the start, and then they mark the test, and then if they've done well, they let them keep it. If they haven't done well, they take it back. Now, of course, you're in one of the roughest school districts in the US and the world, and you're telling a kid who hasn't improved on his maths test, I'll have that $20 back. Yeah, good luck with that, right? Doesn't really work. They even had to call the security guards, and they were frisking the students, which is, by the way, some of you may recognize me as that guy who was being frisked down in the lobby yesterday morning. I don't know if anybody thought, this is strange. That's currently being explained right now in 21st century crime fighting. So if you're thinking, I'm not sure I trust this guy, that was all an elaborate ruse, right? Let's come back to the story. So the security guards are frisking the students. They find, Sally hadn't told me the gender of the security guard, but they found $20 in a girl's bra. And of course, the girl immediately says, well, my grandmother gave it to me. And then they phone the grandmother, who beautifully does not skip a beat, and says, yeah, I gave that to her. No, clearly she did not, right? But she just knows it's an opportunity to lie here. So Sally, much smarter than a lot of us working in education research, he went away and spoke with John List, who was working on that paper as well, and they said, well, this is a problem. Even if the kids aren't doing well, we're still giving them $20. I think we might have to have a word with the funders. This is going to cost like 4 times as much as we thought. And they said, well, actually, why don't we get them to sign to say that they have definitely received it? And one of the nice things about it is it strengthens the loss aversion mechanism, right? You don't just give them the $20, you get them to sign, this is now mine. So, everything that goes wrong whilst being a problem is also an opportunity if you look at it hard enough and maybe drink enough, right? Sometimes you're going to have to look pretty hard for it. And also just stay calm. There will be something else after this is finished, right? And it will be fixable, often. And then we're going to talk about what happens if it's not often that fixable. Michael, we're running out of time, so if we can sort of quickly just say how would you sort out all the bad data problems, that'd be cool.
So Raj just gives me data when it's gone wrong, and I just go into a darkened room and come back a month later with a bar chart. That's how it works. So I've run about 180 randomized control trials, of which I estimate with some precision that exactly 0 of them have been perfect. And that's basically just the way it is. If you say you've run a perfect trial, I'm happy to believe you. However, you might want to do a little bit of introspection. And sometimes you know what the problems are going to be. So there was a trial which Raj and I ran last year in which we knew exactly what the problem was going to be because we knew the randomization was going to have a particular flaw because of the way the college we were trialing it in was set up. Sometimes you have no idea what's going to go wrong. There's sort of, if an airline, my father always says that if an airline part can be assembled incorrectly, it will be assembled incorrectly. If there's a thing that can go wrong in a trial, it's going to go wrong in a trial. And we will always find new and amazing ways to cock things up, technical term again. And when things go wrong, you've got to be transparent about it. When you're talking to a trial partner who's spent ages and ages and so much of their time and their energy on a trial, talking to funders, you have to be transparent about it. You've got to think about what went wrong and how to avoid it happening again. Also try and save what you can. If you've got a trial in which the randomization was, let's say, 5% wrong in some way, I'm not sure exactly how one quantifies wrongness, and the data's come out and you're like, oh no, it's 5% wrong, you've still got a better shot at causality than you have with almost any other data set you're going to see outside of a randomized control trial. You're still in a much better place than you would ever be if you hadn't run the trial in the first place. And so there's this tendency to be like, hey, I've got this bath full of water, let's get rid of that baby and all. And actually what you've got is a baby, and those things are important. Because think of the effort and the energy you put into running the trial. You can always save something from these things. I mean, I've had trials that have been unmitigated and unparalleled disasters. But in general, there's something that's salvageable.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we're just going to quickly recap, and then I'm going to have some closing remarks, and then we'll leave more time for questions at the end, which we'll probably just best do informally outside. Just to recap, understand the data. Don't assume it's all going to be fine. If you're collecting data, work out how it's going to happen. Get to know how everything works. Smart interventions, I won't spit, I'll spare you the management speak again. Design your trial to succeed. So just think, are you going to be bundling interventions, and just make sure that you're giving yourself the best bet of finding a winner. Keep up to date with absolutely everything. Set up some kind of infrastructure, especially at the start, so you're really in touch with the guys who are implementing the stuff as much as you possibly can without being slightly annoying. And weekly Skype calls. We have great stuff now where you can actually see people's faces whilst they're telling you it's all going absolutely fine. And you can see quite clearly on their face it's not going fine. So yeah, set those things up regularly. Use behavioural insights, read East, look at the kinds of behavioural levers that we know work. If 35 of your trial partners are doing great and one of them isn't doing that great, let the one know that 35 are doing great and one isn't doing that great. Social norms are very useful. They do tend to help people move along. And also, just, give yourself a break sometimes. There is only so much you can do. And just to sort of finish on a positive note, that, like Michael said, is that even if something hasn't worked out exactly as you wanted it to, you still have the data set, which is almost the most perfectly designed thing to address the policy issue that you have in question, right? So even if it goes wrong, it's still definitely worth doing. And also just remember the slides we were talking about at the beginning. Think about things like Scared Straight. Think about other examples where we've been doing things for years and it turns out they were wrong when we did an evaluation. We really, really believe in this kind of evaluation technique. It's the best there is, and we would urge you to plow on with it. And the other thing I'd urge you to do as policymakers is to think back to this slide, okay? Each one of these trials, as we know, is a considerable amount of work. What can we be doing to make this all easier? I mean, every single, again, I'm sorry for all the education examples, but every single time a school is sending out a report card, and we're not monitoring that in some way, that's a wasted opportunity. You think about how many millions of kids there are out there. We could be slightly tailoring these in different ways and see which of these report cards deliver the greatest improvement in attainment. So why don't we build something which allows us to experiment on a large number of schools simultaneously? Why aren't we doing that in healthcare, for example, with prescriptions? You've got this huge centralized system. Is there some way of making sure people take their drugs properly by slightly manipulating the labels? Why don't we build all stuff like that at the start? So the next time you come up, next time you have a big policy problem put in front of you, think, okay, on one hand, I do need to deliver this policy, and that's absolutely your main priority. I also sort of think somebody else is going to have a similar job to me in 10, 15 years' time. How are we going to help them know whether what we did worked? And how are we going to help them implement new ideas at scale without having to go through some of these issues we've been talking about? That's all I have to say. I'm going to hand over to Michael just for 1 or 2 closing points, and then please do discuss this in person for some questions.
Thanks, Raj. So I just want to, having talked a lot about failure, I also want to talk about the sort of ray of sunshine there, which is typically not me in most meetings. And as Raj said, it is really worth it. There is a moment in every trial which doesn't completely collapse, where you get your data, you press go on your do file or whatever it is you do in SPSS, and the whole thing runs through, and then a regression table comes up, and you have a result. And it's much less equivocal than if it was any other kind of analysis, much less difficult to understand. And there is a moment, which is normally in my case about 15 seconds long, when there is knowledge in the universe that did not exist prior to now, and which you have and nobody else has. And the 15 seconds, because you then turn around and go, Raj, like, take a look at this bar chart. But, because I love bar charts, way too much. But that is actual, genuine discovery that you have done with help, with trial partners, but you've discovered something. 200 years ago, you discover a new piece of knowledge, they pretty much just build a statue to you somewhere. And one day, maybe we'll all have statues. But for the time being, like, we should relish and cherish the fact that we get to discover things which people generations before us didn't get to do, which is fantastic. And that's basically when most of us got into sort of academia. And the other thing is, like, I spend about a quarter of my time at the Kennedy School of Government, and so I have this sort of thing stuck in my head because it says it every 10 yards, which is to say, we shouldn't be asking, like, what can this trial do for me? We should ask what we together as trialists can do for the betterment of mankind. And but over the course of the next 50 to 100 years, the people in this room, the people in this conference, everywhere else, we are going to do trials that are going to make the world substantively better. We may not go from 5% to 70%. But even if we go from 5% to 10%, or from 70% to 72%, the world is still going to be better, and we're going to know it's better because we'll have really good bar charts to prove it. I leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I just wanted to, given that you've got so much experience over so many fields, are you in a position to give people who are planning research in a specific field a feel for the likely attrition rate, which is quite important when you're trying to power a trial, to know what sort of ballpark you're likely to lose in an education study or...
In education, I think the EEF would normally say, I'm not sure if anybody from the EEF is here, that 20%, losing 20% is about what you do.
There are some guidelines.
Yeah, so the EEF website has an amazing amount of detail and this kind of thing on it. For other fields, it depends a great deal on A, the field itself, B, what your outcome measure is, and C, how you're gathering that outcome measure. So if you're doing a trial in education where your outcome measure is, for example, GCSE grades, and you can collect UPN numbers at the beginning, or UPN numbers I appreciate is one of those things where it's wrong, because the N stands for number. If you can do that at the beginning, you can't have attrition. Attrition can't happen, because you'll always have the data at the end. Whether or not the implementation will happen, as in whether the intervention we delivered is a whole other question, and that depends so much on the user. So if you have one of Raj's spreadsheets, 100% goes through every time, I'm sure. If you have my sort of slightly scatty plates in the air kind of approach to things, maybe 20%.
Right. So there's somewhere on your website that...
On the Education Endowment Foundation's website, it's probably the best.
The where?
The Education Endowment Foundation for education. They have things. There is a literature which I can, if you email me, I can direct you to on attrition in various other fields.
Thank you.
Lots. Right. Okay.
I think the lady in the scarf, sir, possibly.
Hi, sorry, very keen person who's delayed. I'm in from RAP. I've got a question about when things go wrong. So just going back to your test, learn, adapt model, you've talked quite a lot in terms of when things go wrong with the randomization or the methods or the implementation. What about when you just don't get the result that you expect, so you don't affect the behavior change that you're expecting to? What's your experience of trying to understand why that's been the case, and how much buy-in do you get from project partners in terms of investing in trying to understand why something hasn't worked? My experience is that everybody kind of, there's a reluctance to kind of throw good money after bad. If it hasn't worked, let's just try and find something that does work, instead of understanding why it didn't and how that could be tweaked and kind of built on as part of an iterative approach.
Sure. So, So I think, it's a very interesting one, because on the academic side, although I don't know how much this is true either, you're meant to embrace null findings and go, well, we all thought this would work, this didn't work. That is a finding. That's, the fact that it didn't work, in inverted commas, doesn't really matter. We all thought this would work. We all got together and thought this is the best alternative. But of course, in the real world, quite sometimes people want a nice bar chart showing that their idea worked, and then they have to work out what to do. I would say you try and build in as many opportunities for getting feedback on what's going on as you possibly can. Lots of stuff that I've tried hasn't worked, but we did lots of surveys of the people before, during, and after to start getting a sense of how they were perceiving it. And those are the clues you want. Again, as well as spending a lot of time on site at the beginning, also spend some time on site during, and you'll get a much better sense of what's going on. So, sorry, which field, is there any particular field that you're talking about?
So I work in the environmental sector, particularly around resource efficiencies, sustainable consumption.
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly what the environment would be here again, but if you have got an intervention, you get to go and watch it in person. That always helps. Michael, did you have any others?
So what I would say is the question, why didn't this work, is no more or less interesting than the question, why did this work? And so if there's something you can do in order to try and understand why it did or didn't work, if you plan that up front with your trial partner, so we're going to do the trial, and then we're going to do a set of interviews afterwards, or we're going to do a survey afterwards to sort of try and unpick the mechanism a little bit. That would be interesting, whether it works or whether it doesn't work. And like you say, they're unlikely to throw good money after bad if you come back after you've gotten all result and say, let's do this. But if it's always been part of the plan, they're much more likely to go for it.
And one other thing I might mention is that if you remember the sort of smart intervention stuff, for starters, it'd be good to know, did the intervention actually happen, right? And if the intervention did not happen, who was meant to do it? Or even if it did happen, who did it? And then go and talk to them. So part of those swim lane diagrams at least identify points where you can be collecting feedback from people, points where you can be observing what's going on. And if you design that all at the beginning, you're in a better position. Sorry, just that gentleman there, yeah? It's Dan, is that Dan? Oh, right.
I guess I had a question about kind of following up on this, which is sort of how you perceive the work you're doing yourself as opposed to, here's my question. How is this a scientific approach and how is it not a scientific approach? Because, for example, the why it didn't work is a great question in science because you've had a mechanistic account for why you thought it was going to work in the first place and you start breaking down what the mechanism is. But a lot of the times, what I'm hearing at least, is you just want something to work. So we're going to try a bunch of stuff and we're going to do the interventions. And so there's a little bit less of that scientific rigor or attachment to a particular theory of why you think it's going to work. And I guess I'm just questioning, I have the question of how do you balance all of those things when you're thinking about designing an intervention, when you're thinking about designing its impact, how much of it is, the other reason I thought of that, by the way, is that you keep using the words RCT or trial, and somebody else might call it an experiment, but we don't want to call it that because then some people might get turned off or something, right? So I guess I'm just trying to think of how do we blend the rigor of science with the great potential impact of randomized controlled trials and things like that.
Sure. So I think the reason we call them randomized controlled trials is because experiments and tribulations would have been a really awful name for a session. So slightly more seriously, I guess. So I had an experience in my misspent youth where I sort of got what I would call theory blindness, where you sort of, I have a theory of what I want to test, and I'm going to test this in every environment I come across. And so I went into a series of environments in which actually the world wasn't working in the way that my theory suggested, and therefore I was just wasting data. I was wasting trial, I was wasting time, I was wasting goodwill. And so I don't think if it's okay for me to push slightly back, that it's fair to characterize what we do as being not driven by theory. It's just not. I don't arrive in an environment. I don't walk into a school and say, "Hey, I've got a solution to your problems." I sit down with the people in the school. We listen to them. We learn what their problems seem to be. So you're talking about behavioral biases. Why is it that these suboptimal outcomes are occurring? Why is it that young people from poor backgrounds with good grades don't apply to university? What biases do we think are leading them to this path, if any biases at all? And what does the literature, what does the theory tell us are things which can be, are interventions which work on that mechanism which we believe exists? And if I get, so Ryan Buell at Harvard Business School, who's a great guy, has a sort of, he's really interested in transparency. Dave Rand at Yale is really interested in cooperation. Mike Norton is really interested in everything. If I get those three people in 3 rooms and say, here's a problem, tell me what the theoretical underpinning for the solution to this is, I will get 3 answers, and I can predict for 2 of them what it's going to be, and with Mike, it's whatever he had for lunch today is going to be the determining factor. Also, like, whatever it is that goes on inside his brain, which I don't really know. So it's not really sensible from our perspective as sort of policy practitioners trying to do trials to think about the world as of, I have a theory and I'm going to apply it. There are hundreds of theories that could be the solution to this problem. And if I can test 8 of them at once, I'm going to know which one of them was right. And to be honest, quite often it's a little from column A and a little from column B, because almost all economics theory papers start with or in some way, some place in them will say, we divide the world into 2 types of people, and actually there aren't 2 types of people. And you've already gone down a road that's quite unhelpful at that stage. So, yeah, was that a helpful answer or an unhelpful answer?
Well, we can chat more about this tomorrow, Dan, as well. I think we have 2 hours booked in for tomorrow. Sorry, yeah, that gentleman there. So we'll come to you next.
I have a question on the kind of small sample size, and you mentioned it in the factorial design, and we were running an experiment, and we're kind of thinking about that. And on the one hand, you have the opinion of, well, you can pretty much do as many variations as you like, as many people as you have. Basically, so I have 300 people in my sample. Even one person can have one variation, and then you can get the kind of the marginal effects of each of these variations and then pull them together. The problem is that, you kind of end up having these issues with randomization failure. You may have... So, I mean, beyond the fact that it's confusing, as you said, because sometimes, if you're mixing sort of a loss frame, gain frame, and social norms and all that stuff, I guess my question is, from your experience, what's the smallest kind of cell size you should use and I know it's a very specific question, but from your experience, what's the smallest kind of cell size you should go for if you're testing different variations?
386.
So we have a trial. Sorry, should we just take the second question as well, and then we'll start wrapping up. So should we take the second question, and we will come back to that as well. So this gentleman here.
So the question I'm currently holding in my mind is, what's the smallest cell size?
Yeah, and then this gentleman here.
So I work with the Irish government, but a lot of the time, I try and push things like, the RCT is the best approach, but I always come across this thing of, yes, well, RCT is the best approach, but sometimes they're not applicable, which is fair enough, and sometimes people say, but there are other approaches as well, and maybe they're easier, maybe we should do those. So, first of all, do you think that's true? And second of all, if so, what's the second best thing that you can do?
Yeah, I think that's a good point as well. So I think what we might do is that's quite a specific technical question. Should we pick that one up at lunch? Is that all right?
Yep, that's fine.
And then just this one, I think, it's a good point actually, and something that we should have probably discussed as well, is what do you do if you can't do a trial? And there are worlds where you can't do a trial. Michael and I will always push back very hard on the idea that you can't do a trial, but we sort of gluttons for punishment that way. But yes, it's not always going to be possible. I also think it would be nicer. I think Ewan Bremner, who works at the Cabinet Office, told us he would like it if there was some easier entry level of evaluation for people, just to start getting their heads thinking about what they have evaluated, and later, and get everything out of that. That might be some qualitative stuff, some interviews, and after that, get to a point where they think, okay, well, this is great, but we don't know what would have happened if we hadn't done it. And eventually, they will come to this journey where they will want to do a trial themselves. I completely agree that this isn't always the best thing to do immediately. And part of the prototyping phase is not necessarily trialing, it's just designing a thing and going to people, here's a thing, do you like using this thing? And that often does come first. Where you can't do a trial, again, I think at lunch, Michael was happy to give you his top 15 evaluation methods and rank them for you, and where they are and where they aren't appropriate. Yeah, there will always be bar charts. But I think we might do, because as the questions get more and more specific, we might wrap things up, have lunch, and please you just come and ask us specific questions.
Can I use 1 minute to respond to that question?
You can use 1 minute, okay.
So I hear this fairly often, is like, oh, we should do something else because it's easier. We should do parentheses score matching because it's easier. We should do any kind of other things because it's easier. And it's like saying, oh, I need to go about 100 yards away. I'm not going to walk, I'm going to take the car because it's easier. It's like, really depends on your definition of easier. If you want to take a car apart, you're looking at tens of thousands of moving parts. You're looking at metal. You're looking at explosions being necessary to happen in order to propel the thing along the ground. Parentheses score matching is easier insofar as you can do it from your office. That's the only way in which it's easier. If you ever look at the standard error structure of a parentheses score matching model with replacement, it's an absolute chuffing nightmare. And it's really hard to put into a bar chart, which is really important. But so a good comparison, or a comparison which I find helpful in my own mind, is Raj Chande, who has won the John Bates Clark Medal and is one of the leading economists in the world, does a lot of quasi-experimental stuff. And his papers are things of beauty. These are incredible. I read them, I think, if I spent 1,000,000 years thinking about this problem, I would not have come up with that way of analyzing that and that way of working it out. Because he's a genius. I am incredibly mediocre and I'm doing randomized control trials. The reason for that isn't because I thought it was going to be hard, it's because they're easy. It's the opposite of the Kennedy thing. Like, I'm doing this because it's easier. It's so much easier.
Okay, thanks everyone for your time. We'll catch up with you at lunch.